Here we are on part 2 of our lecture on biological concepts, and now that we know what the study of biology is and a little bit about what the qualities and characteristics of life are, we're going to move on and talk a little bit about how we classify living organisms, because it turns out scientists have a very rigorous, structured, and predictable way in which they classify organisms. So we're going to talk first about what's called taxonomy. And what taxonomy is basically is the art or the way in which we identify and classify different organisms. Okay, and taxonomy is nice because it does a couple of things. One, it makes sure that we're all very clear that we're discussing the same organism. If we relied only on common names for organisms, it's easy to have people from different areas of the country or from different countries using the same common name for organisms that are completely unrelated to each other. And I'll give you an example. I'm from Montana, and up in Montana we have these little things called gophers. And they're cute, and they're small, and they're furry, and they look like a little ground squirrel. In fact, they are a little ground squirrel. And they tend to get run over a lot on the highway. Down in Texas, they have something that gets run over a lot on the highways too, that they also call a gopher. But it turns out that what they call a gopher, we in Montana call a turtle. Now, if I didn't know that they had a different organism they referred to as a gopher down in Texas, I could have a conversation with the Texan about how cute and furry and fuzzy gophers are, and that Texan might have a very strange look on her face, thinking, I've never seen a turtle that was fuzzy or cute. So if I use instead the scientific name for a gopher, okay, the Montana version of a gopher, and the Texan uses a scientific name for their version of a gopher, we would know readily that we were talking about two very different organisms. So that's the first advantage of taxonomy, is that it helps us identify and clarify what organism we're talking about. The other cool thing is that in this process of classifying organisms, we also are able to very quickly tell you or indicate to you the relationships among organisms. We know that all organisms within a particular grouping are relatively closely related to each other and distantly related to other organisms in other groupings or other taxa. Okay, taxa is the plural version for all these different groupings. Taxon is the singular of taxa. We're going to see that there's a very predictable order in where we start out with the most inclusive groups, and we go all the way down to the least inclusive groups. And it looks something like this. Domains are the most inclusive groups. There's 3 domains of living organisms on planet Earth that we know of. And then within each of those domains, there are a number of kingdoms. Within each of those kingdoms, there are a number of phyla. Phylum is singular. Within each of those phyla are different classes of organisms. Within each class of organisms, there are a number of orders. Within each one of those orders, there are a number of families. And within each family, one or more genera. Genus is singular. Genera is plural. And lastly, there are a number of species within a genus. Okay, one or a number. So we go from, as I said, most inclusive down to least inclusive. You should know this order: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So let me give you an example. Let's take Homo sapiens, that's us, our scientific name, and let's look at how we fall into this classification scheme, starting with the most inclusive, which is domain. We are in the domain Eukarya. There are 3 domains I'm going to talk about in just a minute on another slide, but we belong to the domain Eukarya. Within the domain Eukarya, there are 4 different kingdoms, and we belong to the kingdom Animalia. Within the kingdom Animalia, there are a number of phyla. Notice phyla is plural. We belong to the phylum, that's singular, Chordata, which means that we have a backbone. Okay, within the phylum Chordata, there are a number of classes, one for birds, one for amphibians, one for reptiles, one for mammals. We belong to the Mammalia class. And within mammals, there are a whole bunch of different orders of mammals. We belong to the primate order. Within the primates, there are a number of families. We belong to Hominidae. And within the family Hominidae, we belong to the genus Homo, and we are the specific species within that genus called Homo sapiens. Now, for your own interest, you can compare how corn is classified instead. You'll notice we're in the same domain as corn, but after that, things get quite a bit different all the way down to uh, its full species name, which is Zea mays. Now, as promised, I told you I'd tell you about these three different domains. Since there are three domains on planet Earth, let's talk about them. The one you're most familiar with is the eukarya. Eukarya is the domain in which we are found, okay, and plants and funguses and lots of other organisms. And in science, it's good to know the roots of words because if you know the roots to words, you can oftentimes figure out new words you've never seen before. So let me just tell you that the EU, the first part of the word eukarya, means true. And karyo or karya means kernel. So literally, eukarya means true kernel. And you can think of kernel as also meaning nucleus. Okay, so this is, in other words, those organisms whose cells contain a true nucleus. That means that the DNA is bound or contained within this organelle called a nucleus. We're going to learn more about organelles in just a couple weeks. Now let's compare that with bacteria, which is the second of the three domains on planet Earth. The bacteria are unicellular, meaning they are all only one cell, whereas the eukarya that we belong to can be either unicellular or multicellular. Bacteria are unicellular and they are prokaryotes. Now remember again, karyo means kernel or nucleus. Pro means before. So prokaryotes are before kernels. These are cells that do not have a true nucleus. Now that does not mean that they do not have DNA. Okay? They do have DNA. It's just that that DNA is not housed within this special structure called a nucleus. Now the third domain is the archaea, and the archaea are also prokaryotes. They're very similar to bacteria. They're unicellular, but their claim to fame that makes them distinct is that they survive in very extreme environments, either extremely hot environments, extremely cold environments, extremely salty environments, what have you. They survive in extreme environments. Now there's a table down here at the bottom of this slide, table 20.3 from your book, that talks about the major differences between all these three different domains of life. You should know these characteristics. Some of them you may not know. You may not know, for example, what ribosomes are yet, but within a couple weeks you will. And before exam one, you'll know all of these terms here, with the exception of the last one, introns. That's one you won't need to worry about just yet. We'll get to that later in the semester. All right, now that we know about the three domains, let's look within the kingdoms and within the domains and see what kingdoms are there. For archaea, the kingdoms are still being worked out. We know so little about archaea that we really are still trying to just tease apart the relationships among the organisms within this domain. The good news for you is that that means there are no kingdoms that you have to learn for the archaea. And the same goes for bacteria. Actually, we know of a number of kingdoms in the bacteria, but again, they're still being worked out, and there's discussion among scientists about what is the correct classification scheme. So since they can't agree on it, we won't worry about it. Now within eukarya, the domain to which we belong, there are four kingdoms, and you do need to know these. There's the kingdom Animalia that we belong to, kingdom Plantae, where we find all the plants and trees and shrubs, kingdom Fungi, which is where we find mushrooms and yeast, and kingdom Protista, which is the kingdom that contains all the unicellular eukaryotes, okay, single-celled eukaryotes, things like euglena and amoebas. So those are the kingdoms. Below the level of kingdom, I'm not going to make you memorize anything, but you should know the classification order of domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Now when we get to looking at scientific names, you've noticed, I hope, when I say scientific names like Homo sapiens or Zea mays, that those are all two-name names. That's called binomial nomenclature. Bi means two, nomial or nom means name. Binomial nomenclature. It's a two-name naming system that was developed by this guy here, Carolus Linnaeus, in the 1700s, and it's universally used as the means by which we identify organisms. And it's based on the Latin language, which is why it has all the US's on the ends of it and funny plurals and things, like the difference between phylum and phyla. Um, so the way that the scientific naming system goes is the first of the two names is always the genus name. And by the way, the plural of genus is genera. Don't you just love Latin language? Remember, the plural of phylum is phyla. The plural of genus is genera. So the first of the two names in binomial nomenclature is genus. The second of the two names is the species name. Now the genus name we always capitalize, the species name we always leave lowercase, and the entire two-word name is in italics always. So if we look here at Homo sapiens here, you can see this name is in italics. That Homo is capitalized, that's the genus part of the name, and sapiens is lowercase, that's the species part of the name. So you should be comfortable with what are the proper rules for writing a scientific name and know which is the genus and which is the species designation. Okay, that's the end of taxonomy and systematics. We're going to move on next and discuss a little bit about scientific methods. See you there.